Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tom Miles. I'm the Dean of the Law School, and it's a great pleasure today to welcome you to today's virtual Emeritus lecture. This is a special program for alumni who graduated 40 or more years ago from the law school. Thank you all for tuning in and for your ongoing engagement with our law school. Now, I hope that you and your family and friends are remaining healthy and doing well, especially as we inch closer towards what we hope is a safe post-pandemic life. Now, last year, our Emeritus lecture was one of our very first live remote format events. And although I regret we're not able to gather in person again this year, I am happy to report that the university and the law school are in the process of resuming regular activities on campus. We remain cautiously optimistic that throughout the next academic year, our alumni community will be able to gather in person. As you know, the law school safely delivered a mix of remote and in-person instruction to our students throughout the 2020-2021 academic year. This was in no small part due to our faculty's steadfast commitment to transformative legal education and to serious intellectual engagement. Our faculty play an important role in social and economic policy and in legal education everywhere. And we are delighted to provide this opportunity for all of you to engage with one of our most distinguished colleagues. I'm honored to introduce our faculty speaker for today, Professor Tom Ginsburg. He is the Leo Spitz Professor of International Law here in the law school and also a member of the Department of Political Science. Professor Ginsburg represents the very best of what the University of Chicago is all about: serious and searching intellectual inquiry and participatory learning and teaching. Now, all of you, as our graduates, know that intellectual inquiry at the law school aspires to be broad and far-reaching and rigorous, focused on the most important questions, often deploying interdisciplinary methods, and unafraid to challenge conventional wisdom. And perhaps that's why faculty at the University of Chicago have so often made path-breaking contributions that help define entire fields of inquiry. Over the past century, the law school's faculty were pivotal in establishing administrative law, legislation, comparative law, and other topics as legitimate fields of inquiry in law. And in Professor Tom Ginsburg, we see these aspirations realized again. Professor Ginsburg has almost single-handedly established the field of comparative constitutionalism. He currently co-directs the Comparative Constitutions Project, an effort funded by the National Science Foundation to gather and analyze constitutions of all independent nation states since 1789. And Professor Ginsburg has received many accolades for his extraordinary scholarship. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. 3 years ago, he delivered the Hirsch-Lauderpausch Lectures at Cambridge University in England, and these are the most prestigious named lectures in international law. 2 years ago, the book he co-authored with our colleague, Professor Aziz Huq, How to Save a Constitutional Democracy, received wide acclaim and the top book prize from the Society for International Public Law. 2 years ago, just before the pandemic, he and Professor Huq delivered a university-wide Harper Lecture about that book, and it was the most well-attended Harper Lecture in the history of the university. Next month, Professor Ginsburg and Claudia Flores, who is one of our clinical professors and the director of the Global Human Rights Clinic here at the law school, are going to launch a podcast. The podcast is entitled, Why Rights Matter and What's the Matter with Rights. The podcast will highlight how rights matter. Conversations about rights can be polarizing, confusing, and frustrating. Professors Ginsburg and Flores have traveled the world to probe deeply human rights debates. On their new podcast entitled, they will use that expertise to explore the stories and the thorny questions about why rights matter and what's the matter with rights. So please watch for that. And today, I am thrilled to welcome Professor Ginsburg to speak. His talk is entitled Democracies and International Law. And after his presentation, he will take questions. And now I'm delighted to turn the program over to Professor Tom Ginsburg.
Thank you so much, Dean Miles, and thanks to everyone for taking some of your time to talk today, to listen to the talk today, and to engage. Um, this project, Democracies in International Law, is something that grows out of the lectures Dean Miles mentioned a few years ago on international law, 3 years ago at Cambridge University. And I've developed the ideas, and they're coming out actually in a book probably in the next couple months. And so you are the first to sort of hear what I learned basically from that process. And the question of democracies in international law is one in which international lawyers have spent a lot of time, and it's obviously incredibly important in our current moment of democratic backsliding, where we're looking around for anything which can help to prevent democratic backsliding in weak environments, even something that poses threats here at home. So what exactly can international law do about this? And there's a long debate about it. I just want to begin by drawing on the book that Dean Miles mentioned with Professor Huck, How to Save a Constitutional Democracy, for my definition of democracy. So we have a relatively thin definition of democracy, which of course includes elections. Any definition of democracy must include elections in which the loser turns over power voluntarily. We actually add, and in which the modal adult can vote. And so that means that democracy really doesn't emerge till the early 20th century, when women are given the right to vote. There's a few rights, core rights, which are related to that election process, that process of selecting leaders: rights to free speech, rights to associate, rights to vote. But we don't include the whole gamut of social and political or social and economic rights, though some other scholars might do so. We want a pretty thin definition. And then, of course, democracy requires, and I think this has become quite apparent to us in the last 6 months in the United States, the rule of law in bureaucracy. And what do I mean by that? At the most basic level, when you have an election, you need someone to be able to count the ballots in a neutral way. And one of the reasons the November 2020 election was such a success is that we had tens and tens of thousands of local election officials who followed the law and counted the votes in a neutral way. And obviously, that's really essential for democracy to work. I don't think it's usually appreciated quite how important that is. And of course, courts that will uphold the law and such. So that's part of our definition too. Now, what's nice about this definition from an international law point of view is it sort of aligns with some of the international treaties which talk about democracy. The International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights emphasizes these particular rights, emphasizes a right to participate in your government, and emphasizes bureaucracy, actually, the civil service, interestingly. And so these kind of definitions, I think, align nicely. However, international law is a really big and complicated field. And I sometimes think of it as what Professor Sunstein, of course, who used to teach at the law school, might describe as a incompletely theorized agreement. What did he mean by that? That it contains sort of principles which are in some tension with each other. And these are really apparent when you go and look at the United Nations Charter. The United Nations Charter speaks of human rights and has this idea of self-determination, which sort of implies some democratic process. And yet, of course, we all know that the United Nations has been composed for vast portions of its history of mainly dictatorships. The United Nations Charter also, besides sort of talking about human rights and democracy, also, on the other hand, mentions the right of all states to choose their political system free of outside interference. There's no ability to interfere in matters essentially within the domestic jurisdiction. And of course, you can't invade states to impose democracy or anything like that. And so that means that you have, and I think a classical view of international law is that it's supposed to promote exchange and cooperation across regime types or among countries with very different political, social systems, very different theories. And so that's a kind of thin view of international law. In the last couple decades, there have been some who have promoted what they call a right to democracy, an international human right to democratic governance. And this, you might say, is saying that international law has to lean in that direction. It has to be on the side of human rights, on the side of democratic government. I myself reject this view, in part because I don't think not everything that's good and important in the world needs to be called a right. This is sort of related to the theme of the podcast Dean Miles mentioned. Rights are useful for some things and not for others. But in particular, in the international sphere, if we are to say that there is a right to democracy, then we're presumably saying that about half the countries on earth are illegitimate members of the international community. I don't think that's going to do us much good in the long run. So I don't believe there is a right to democracy, but I do think that there is some ability for international law to support democratic governance. In 2016, there were 2 elections in West Africa. The picture on the top there is Yahya Jammeh, who was the dictator of the Gambia, which is, you can see on the little map, a tiny country surrounded by Senegal at the very western point of Africa. And he held an election which he surprisingly lost, which is interesting. Dictatorships still have elections and sometimes surprises happen. But when Jammeh refused to acknowledge the result, the regional organization, which is called ECOWAS, whose members are noted in the map in blue, said to him, wait a minute, you've got to honor that election. Our charter, we have a charter of good governance in this region. And notwithstanding the fact that many of the countries were not democratic, they organized an intervention. And the military came to the Senegalese border and said, you've got to step down, Jammeh. And eventually he did, in a kind of bloodless intervention. So this is the region stepping up to enforce, as a matter of regional international law, a democratic principle. Now, that same year, there was an election in Equatorial Guinea. And the picture in the lower right is the dictator of that country, Teodorine Obiang. That country is the richest state in Africa in per capita terms, in sub-Saharan Africa. And its people are among the poorest. And the reason is Obiang and his family take all the money. And there's actually an interesting international law case at the International Court of Justice involving his son, who lives in Paris and was spending, tens of millions of dollars. And the French government wanted to go after that money for corruption. And the son said, oh, wait a minute, I'm the vice president of the country. I have the immunity. So a very interesting question of could you go after this dictator's kid to get some of the money? But that's an aside. The big point is that he held an election too in his country. He won the election by over 90% vote. The opposition couldn't organize. Not a real democratic election. And when Jammeh was kicked out of Gambia, where did he go? He went to Equatorial Guinea, where he remains today. And so, to some degree, these 2 elections, to me, embodied the tension in international law. On the one hand, we shouldn't interfere. Obiang can steal his people's money. He can run fake elections, and we can't do anything about that. We can't certainly invade to remove him. On the other hand, if you have an election and it doesn't meet regional standards, well, then maybe we will gather and, in this case, with the support of the UN Security Council, pressure you into, turning the country over to democracy. So both principles operating in the same region at exactly the same time. It illustrates somewhat of the tension that we are in now. What my book does is go through, the history of international law with regard to these principles. It asks whether democracies have a greater propensity to use international law than non-democracies. And then it looks at cases where we have problems, crises like this, and what international law can do about that. And it's there's a big theory chapter, and I'll just try to summarize that. If you think about it, what is the big difference between a democracy and a dictatorship? In a dictatorship, the government cares about remaining in power, and the government and the regime, broadly speaking, are the same thing. The time horizon of the government is the same as that of the regime, of the dictatorship. And of course, but the definition of democracy is actually the reverse of that, if you think about it. Democracy works because when parties step down, when they lose office, they know that the regime is going to continue. The democracy, the democratic system will continue even if I'm out of power for a while, and I can go nurse my wounds and then come back. So it's that rotation in office which defines democracy. And what that does is it gives democratic governments the ability to sort of think more long term. I argue. And in particular, they have the ability to cooperate with other countries to sort of, you know, produce public goods that could not be produced within a single country. Now, the United States is a really big country, but imagine you're a small country in West Africa, for example, and you have a very limited market. It might make sense to have a trade agreement with the neighboring country, so your producers can sell to bigger markets. Might make sense, as ECOWAS does, to have a kind of regional security arrangement, so that you can join together if the region is threatened from outside. That's a kind of public good, right? Those are public goods that are produced at a bigger level than just one nation state. You might also imagine a situation where two countries, share a border, a river, or something like that, and they've got to manage it jointly, like the U.S. and Mexico do. Well, that's what international law does. It allows the production of public goods across borders. Now, because dictatorships tend to have very short time horizons, they're not so interested in really hands-tying deep public goods, things which require long-term commitment. Instead, you see, I think, or the theory would predict, thinner international law, not so deeply cooperative, less reliance on courts, international courts, and dispute resolution, because, of course, that, when you go to a court, you might lose the case. And while a democracy that loses a case, say, before the International Court of Justice can say, oh, well, sorry, we lost that one, we're going to move on. In a dictatorship, that kind of thing can be very destabilizing. Dictators are afraid not only of their own people, remember, but also of their own coalition, other people in government. Most dictators lose office because of someone else in the coalition, not because of a revolution from below, but because of a coup d'etat or in some of the Middle Eastern monarchies, we see, children kicking their parents out of power so they can become the king and such. And so, keeping everyone happy inside is really a tough job. And opening yourself up to surprises from outside is not very attractive. So that's kind of the theory of why these countries would be different. And what I do in the book is I go through lots of evidence for this. I examine, for example, countries that sign treaties. So this looks at categorizes countries into 5 boxes, moving to the right, with more, heading towards more democracy on the right, and the average number of treaties those countries have. And you could see more democracy, more treaties. I actually dusted off a data set. Dean Miles doesn't know this, but he had written a paper, which never got published, actually, 10 or 15 years ago, looking at treaties, sort of using this very framework in which I'm discussing. And he and Professor Posner gathered this data. So I actually went back and got their data and looked at it from the point of view of democracy. And the way I looked at this is I looked at bilateral treaties, treaties between two countries, and asked, what was the nature of that dyad? Was it among two democracies? Was it among two dictatorships? Was there one in each category? And what this shows you is that the vast majority of these treaties were made among pairs where both countries were democratic. And this is kind of surprising. Only 40% of countries were democratic during this entire period. So I think you'd predict only 16% of dyads would be something like, would be jointly democratic. And yet we see, the vast majority of treaties are among that set. There are also a significant number of treaties among half democratic dyads, if I can use the term. Authoritarians just don't sign very many treaties. And that's sort of consistent with what I'm saying. The other thing I did is I looked at, and this is a little hard to read for those who aren't familiar with stats, but I'll explain it. What I did is looked at some countries which have periods in which they're a democratic country and periods in which they're a dictatorship. So like Turkey kind of moved back and forth. Thailand, where I used to live, went back and forth. And I examined countries that switch and ask, were they more likely to sign treaties when they were in a democratic state or an authoritarian state? And this figure sort of shows you the probability of doing so, controlling for wealth, that's the middle line there, and controlling for the number of neighbors. because obviously if you have more neighbors, you're going to want to sign more treaties as well. So it turns out, yeah, countries with more neighbors do sign more treaties. Richer countries tend to sign more treaties. But even controlling for those things, these particular states are more than twice as likely to sign a treaty when they're in a democratic state than when they're not. So I have lots of evidence looking at court cases, all kinds of things in the book. We are obviously in a period of the rise of authoritarianism, and it's a major challenge to the international system, to our own country. And one of the things that we are observing is what I call the rise of authoritarian international law. And what this has to do, what this is about, is authoritarians using international law to advance their own particular purposes, to extend their own survival and the reach of authoritarian rule across space, sort of a proactive authoritarian law. And it's relatively new. You did have, of course, in the Cold War, things like Comecon, the Warsaw Pact. But looking at those very closely, I characterize most of those things as basically being mimicry. They took some, sort of club of democracies and kind of copied the same framework. But we are not seeing that anymore. We're seeing much more sophisticated use of international law by authoritarians. And let me just jump down. One example is the China's famous Belt and Road Initiative. China is a big leader in using international law in the last couple of decades. The Belt and Road Initiative, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, is this very ambitious program to link, everywhere from Spain all the way to Australia, actually, in a network of trade and cultural exchange, and essentially sort of a Chinese dominated group in which, interestingly, all of the arrangements are really bilateral. It's very different from the sort of big pro-democratic organizations, you might say the OECD or even NATO, which were multilateral in character. There is an annual Belt and Road Summit, but the structure of those meetings is that each of these countries goes and has an audience with Xi Jinping, and it's a hub and spokes kind of network. So it's a thinner kind of international law, but one that gives China quite a bit of depth, if you will, strategic depth in terms of recycling its trade surpluses, recycling productive capacity and such. We are also seeing much more active Chinese behavior at the United Nations. And one example here that's very important is the cyberspace regulation. Cyberspace right now is regulated by something called the Budapest Convention, which is a Council of Europe document, and sort of, provides rules by which governments are supposed to follow. And at the United Nations in the last few years, Russia and China have jointly sponsored an alternative draft treaty, which is much more heavy on state control, much more heavy on principles like security, allowing states to essentially regulate cyberspace much more intensively. Now, in particular, the last few years, the United States has been very disengaged from the United Nations and from these various processes. And that has meant that China has been able to get a lot of votes. Indeed, there are many, many issues on which China is really a dominant player in the United Nations, in areas where you would think it would not be. For example, when a country proposed a resolution criticizing Chinese repression in Xinjiang in the far west, not one member of the Organization of the Islamic Conference, 50-something member organization of majority Muslim countries or countries with large Muslim populations, not one of them voted for that resolution. Every one of them voted with China to say it's an internal matter. Well, why did they do that? Because they are authoritarians. And because, of course, there's, would be consequences were they not to do so. So the other thing one has seen in the Chinese case is the rise of extraterritorial application of domestic law. Here I have in mind the national security law of Hong Kong, which has been used to repress and arrest and essentially change civil space in Hong Kong in the course of less than a year since it was promulgated, because it's about a year ago. And that law has extraterritorial application. If I was to sit on this Zoom call and call for the secession of Hong Kong, which I'm not, but if were I to do so, I would be violating Chinese law and could be arrested the next time I set foot in Hong Kong. Or if I set foot in China, I could be extradited to Hong Kong. So that's a kind of, major challenge, obviously, to freedom of speech and our traditions of political openness. We also see international organizations like something called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which has been used to create new norms. So they created new sort of international crimes. For about, at least 20 years, there's been an international crime of terrorism. And that's, something that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization really also prohibits. And it's an epithet that gets thrown around a lot now, usually against civil society people and Democrats. They're called terrorists. And so, but because it's an international crime, the international law is kind of being used to repress them. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization has also created a couple other things, which is a couple other new crimes: separatism and extremism. So many of the people in Hong Kong have been charged with extremism, which is an extremely vague formulation. The definition is quite unclear. Secessionism is a little clearer, but that really goes to very core issues in international law, ideas about self-determination and such. China and other authoritarians are basically changing the content of it and the norms in order to advance their particular agendas. One can see some evidence of this in the number of international organizations that exist around the world. So I've counted these. And what I do is I look at them by the percentage of members by their democracy score using these political science measures. I'll show you the picture here. So what this indicates, if you look, 0 means no members of that international organization were Democratic, and 1 means all of them are. And you can see there's a lot of international organizations in the middle. But what I think is significant is there are almost as many organizations composed only of authoritarians than Democrats. And that means that sort of image I presented at the outset, showing that democracy has by and large been produced by democracies working together to create public goods, is now changing. That's only going to accelerate as we see the advance of authoritarian international law around the world. So it's a big challenge to us, and I do believe that international law can do something about it. We have the example I gave of ECOWAS in the Gambia. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes when there is a leader who does not step down after an election, the regional organization or international organization will criticize them and they will be affected. But just as many times, they are not. The international criticism falls on deaf ears. Democracy's survival ultimately is a domestic matter, right? Democracy survives because you have two forces, roughly, that believe that they are better off, stepping down after they lose because the other side will honor certain basic rules and then they can come back, right? It's conflict within an agreed upon set of basic rules. And it is not for every society. I don't think it is. I don't think we could have a system composed only of democracies. It requires a certain level of wealth, a certain kind of cultural give and take, certainly one that's under challenge in our own country. And, its conditions are not universal. But the demand for such things is very wide. And so when a country is democratizing, the international community can do some things at the margins. So I close the book with some suggestions, and I'll just present a few. So one idea that has come up and President Biden has brought up is this idea of a community of democracies. Imagine a club of democracies that was global and would all work together. There actually is such an international organization already in existence. And, that's a great idea. It's not likely to be super successful, in part because there are so many countries nowadays that are in the middle. India, the world's largest democracy, as we like to say, has been downgraded on many international assessments to being a flawed democracy. for reasons that those of you who follow Indian politics know quite well, which is basically a party that is trying to ensure that it never loses office. So, membership is tricky. The other thing is, of course, even democracies don't have common interests on everything, and so they might not be willing to always share. Um, the Another thing we might emphasize more is what I call preservative democracy support, by which I mean, just simply shoring up democratic institutions, technical support for things like election commissions and the management of elections, judges, and things like this. This has been going on for some decades, and I've had some involvement in this kind of work. But it is important. It's important for Democrats in any particular society to know that there are outside resources and to know how basically to run democratic institutions. So I think that's very important. I also think there may be some ability to find common ground with some dictatorships. And here I emphasize the common project of ending corruption, tax havens and things like this, where, we actually do have some common interest with the Chinese government on this point. China is certainly a pretty corrupt place, and in many cases, many third countries actually is an active contributor to corruption. Yet, there may be some common ground because democracy can't really survive when there's too much corruption. Fourth thing I emphasize is this point that I mentioned before about, actually engaging with the international organizations. It's very easy to walk away and say, oh, these international committees are, biased against us and they're useless and they are toothless. If they were really toothless and useless, I don't think we'd see China investing so much in their operation. They do matter, even if they're not always right. And so my big point here is simple. It's just, something the Biden administration, I think, is already doing, which is not just seed the ground, to recognize that just taking your marbles and going home doesn't mean you're going to win. In fact, what it does is it allows the implantation of norms and the supplantation of traditional democratic norms from the international sphere. And so I think that's really important to engage with. The final point I make is that, it can be pretty depressing, even here in the United States. Our democracy clearly is in trouble and has had a terrible year. But as I believe for the United States, I also believe for the rest of the world that, we shouldn't despair too much. There's always going to be some space for democracy because there is always and often demand internally and from below for its benefits, for good governance. I actually have highlighted here 3 countries where we've seen some very active democratic movements in the last couple of years. I might add South Africa, which has just gone through an extremely traumatic exercise in the rule of law and ensuring that President Zuma could not get away with corruption. And it was a violent episode in which he called out his forces, his private folks, and they engaged in a lot of destruction. Very, very knife's edge kind of thing. But that's a good story for democracy in the sense that it did survive. The Sudan, there was a military coup, and the regional organization said, you, the military, cannot govern alone. We will not recognize you. You need a democratic or civilian component. Now, it's kind of a mixed government right now. But I would submit that it is better off than it would be otherwise. Certainly better off than the government of the Sudan before, which was pure dictatorship. Malawi, which is the tiny country in the southern part of Africa up on the top of my slide, during COVID, its president wanted to suspend the election and remain in office. And the court said, no, not only can you not suspend the election, you cannot even have a lockdown because that would somehow inhibit the opposition from mobilizing. And the court won that battle, and Malawi had an election, and that president lost. So, and then Armenia, which, even though it's kind of not in a great neighborhood, has managed to retain a kind of democratic government, certainly for the last couple of years, and undermine some of the endemic corruption there. So that there are some good stories is the point. I predict that the world is going to be a little like the United States, and this is a prediction for the United States. We're seeing unprecedented, well, certainly not since Jim Crow, unprecedented efforts at vote suppression and changing basic institutions to lock one party in power in many, many American states right now. I think, the case for the United States, our democracy is in trouble. I think our overall democracy as a country is going to survive. But I also think we're going to have pockets of subnational authoritarianism, maybe is the way to use the word, where you cannot actually hope for a meaningful change in government, where the institutions are locked in so that even if the population changes and the preferences change, the party will remain in office. That's the definition of dictatorship. And we're going to see that in more countries around the world, certainly. But we're also going to see places where good government wins out and which remain a democracy. And that's just the nature of the democratic enterprise. It's always a struggle. It's always a grind. It's always a fight. And it's worth fighting for, in my humble opinion. Okay, thank you. I will stop now. Went a little long and open it up for questions. One of the questions that came in before the session was, how would I rate the democracy of the United States on a scale of 1 to 10? And, it's a very interesting exercise. There's actually someone here at the University of Chicago, Sue Stokes, in the political science department, who's part of a organization called Bright Line Watch. And what that refers to is the idea that, when you're in a situation of democratic erosion, slow decline of democracy, it's hard to know where the bright line is, where the point is at which you are no longer a democracy. So what she and her colleagues have done is ask Americans and ask experts, ordinary Americans and experts, to rate the quality of the democracy in the United States on 20 different dimensions. And what's clear from that exercise is that it's not just elites or professors like me who think democracy is in trouble. Ordinary Americans think that we don't run our democracy very well. We don't run our elections well. There's now a big fear of private violence, which of course is the end of democracy if you allow that to happen. Even judicial independence is sometimes criticized. I mean, there's some things on which we do well and some things we don't do well. So to give it an overall score and answer the question is a tough enterprise, a tough exercise. I guess I would say I think we're at about a 5 or 6, still a democracy. We have elections. We had an election. It had consequences. The loser did eventually step down. But I also think that the assault on democracy that happened really, accelerated, from November to January was very, very severe and much worse than I had imagined. When Professor Huck and I wrote that book, we didn't anticipate anything like that. And it's like something that's going to have and is apparently having continuing consequences for many, many years. So we are surely not out of the woods, and the fight is going to be one at many individual state levels. But I think our democracy will indeed survive in some hobbled form. One of the other questions that comes up in this issue of, in the question of international law is is international law, I've kind of already asserted that international law doesn't require democracy. But what about these institutions? They're not democratically elected. Like, who elected the United Nations? Why should we be bound by rules that they make? Isn't it in tension with democracy? And to some degree, that is true. The way to kind of get at it is say, well, yes, but some prior version of our democracy did agree to this particular international agreement. We signed on, we bound ourselves. And so there is a democratic legitimacy in much the same way there is for something like a constitution, that some prior version of the demos of the people had agreed to it, and they did so for a purpose. So that's why I think we do sometimes see democracies comply with international institutions and even delegate tremendous power to them, as in the case of the countries of the European Union. Now, for the United States, though, we've always had a very ambivalent relationship, precisely because we're a democratic country, or have been, and are a powerful one. And we don't really need, we're a very large market. We don't really necessarily need the public goods that are provided by the rest of the world. Most of those major treaties are, of course, things that Americans have promoted and been behind. So in some sense, the whole international order is one that is post-war American creation, one could say. But it's one that we're now turning from. rather drastically. And I think that is hasty, and I don't think it's necessarily a good idea. I think on balance, the system of international law is going to continue, whether we're participating or not, because there's an inherent need for it among states. And that need is to produce public goods. And, sometimes to produce the public goods, you have to tie your hands. You have to say, we're willing to be bound by this court decision, even if we lose it. And democracies are willing to do it. So I don't think there's the tension with democracy is as deep as someone might imagine. Obviously, within our own democracy, we are often subject to institutions which are not particularly democratic, and those are the decisions of courts. So I mentioned the issue of extraterritorial jurisdiction. I see a question from Peter here. Terrific question. To contrast the U.S. use of extraterritorial jurisdiction as with the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, with the Chinese application of extraterritorial jurisdiction. And if there's some limit I would regard as acceptable, limit on extraterritorial jurisdiction. Yes, it's a great question and a great legal question, which, of course, our courts have grappled with. One of the things in Justice Scalia's angle on this question was, does it create is it a reasonable use of extraterritorial jurisdiction? The prior jurisprudence had said, well, you can exercise extraterritorial jurisdiction as long as there's not like some sort of true regulatory conflict where someone is in the position of having to violate one law to comply with another. That would be a limit. And Justice Scalia had a different take. He said, basically, extraterritorial jurisdiction is fine as long as it's reasonable, it comports with the standards of reasonableness. So I think that is the logic of the FCPA. It is extraterritorial, but I think it is generally accepted. The purpose is a good one. Obviously, American companies often criticize it, saying, "Oh my gosh, that we have not been able to, we're at a competitive disadvantage." But the way that was dealt with is combining this policy. We have a policy goal, which is to reduce corruption, combining a use of extraterritorial enforcement by American courts with an international treaty that gets our trading partners to agree to the same norms. That's the OECD Treaty on Corruption. And, that's, I think, been quite an effective regime. The Chinese thing seems to me to be quite different in a sense. It is basically, it is restricting the rights of Americans in America to speak their mind. It's one way to think about it. And there are other countries that do such things. I used to live in Thailand, as I mentioned. If I was to insult the king of Thailand right now, I could be, accused of lèse majesté, of insulting the king, and that might prevent me from ever going back there. So, the question is it a reasonable restriction? And I think that notwithstanding one way to read the Chinese extraterritorial national security law as being reasonable, we don't want people actively fomenting terrorism or, secessionism outside our boundaries. The way it's been applied is very, very loose. And it's very vague law. And so I think it is a problem that it's China kind of experimenting with this form of legal regulation that the United States pioneered and has been very good at for many years. So that's how I see that. And I do think there's at least an arguable difference. Okay, great question from Rod about the time horizon of dictatorships, that the Chinese Communist Party marked its 100th anniversary. Yes, incredibly institutionalized. And of course, we tend to think, I've always called it the Mao Zedong dynasty. It's not really as your question suggests. The ruling family of North Korea is a multi-generational enterprise as well. That's true. So, and monarchies generally, right? Absolute monarchies often have this longer time horizon. That's absolutely true. The question is, how does one then cooperate with other states to produce public goods if you do have a long time horizon? And, I think in what we see in monarchies in particular is that it encourages the cultivation of relationship-based agreements, if you will, not formal treaties, deposited with the United Nations with dispute resolution clauses that you could go before the International Court of Justice. The House of Saud, a great example. They always seek to have a personal relationship with whoever is sitting in the White House. Um, the personalist dictatorship of North Korea is not signing a lot of treaties for public good. So I do think there's a different technology, if you will, for international cooperation that comes from those kind of dictatorships for sure. Yes, some parties do have successful dictatorship, like the Chinese Communist Party, incredibly well institutionalized, not going anywhere, can have a longer term and can actually undertake policies with a long-term view in mind. So it might be very good for the Chinese citizens to have such a government, in some sense, for the average Chinese citizen. My point is this: the Chinese Communist Party thinks of any cost to the party is a cost to the system as a whole, to the regime. They are coterminous. They, really don't care about China after the Mao Zedong dynasty falls. They want that dynasty to last 1,000 years. And that's the different logic of democracies. And it means that they don't really have an incentive to have public commitments that tie their hands and would be implementable through the technology of international law, if I can use the term. That's what I have in mind. There's a question from Sinclair about what makes the law or law resolution part of international law. Is every UN resolution part of international law? Must it be from the Security Council? Yeah, well, that's a great internal question with international law, and it's debated. There are some things that we know are international law. That's clearly treaties. Decisions of the UN Security Council that are undertaken in the name of peace and security. So there aren't very many of those, or they're not, they're pretty rare because that requires, of course, agreement by Russia, China, and the United States. But occasionally you do get those. The resolution to get Saddam Hussein out of Iraq the first time was one such resolution. The Korean War, for various reasons, was justified under that. So those things are clearly and unambiguously international law. There's also the decisions of international courts, which nominally are only binding on the parties, but international lawyers tend to read them, and states tend to read them as if they're kind of building towards general principles of law. And in my teaching of the first-year students, I describe this as very similar to like a very primitive system of law, if you think about it. When states were just being built, well, you start by deciding one case at a time, and then, well, you have 8 cases involving 8 different, sets of disputants, and you realize it's a common principle. So, make a public announcement about it, and it becomes the law. And to some degree, that those dispute resolution mechanisms, the case law, has that same quality. There's a vaguer category of what we call customary international law, and that's something international lawyers debate all the time. What is customary international law, and what constitutes it? And there's some people who think that these General Assembly resolutions, can actually make customary international law, or could be binding. But the UN Charter doesn't say anything about those resolutions being binding in any way. And so I don't think that they are generally binding international law. If every single state agreed to something, then that's a strong indication that they think it should be law. But their legal status is certainly lesser, I would say. And I think my view is kind of an orthodox one on that. And same with, various other resolutions. Some of the regional institutions, I mentioned ECOWAS in West Africa, there's an African Union, there's the Organization of American States. These can be very, these are not creating general international law for all countries in the world, but they are, for their member states, which have signed up for them, able to create and make determinations which are binding on those states as a matter of treaty. And that matters for democracy. Another example I talk about is one that happened a few years ago in Honduras, where the president proposed changing the term limit. Term limit in the Constitution was fixed, so you could only have one term. He said, I'd like to have a referendum because the people love me so much. And in that Constitution, the Honduras Constitution, actually, there was a provision which said anyone who even proposes that loses office immediately. And so the Supreme Court said, you're out of office just for even mentioning that idea. And eventually the military came in and removed him from office. And the rest of the Organization of American States called it a coup d'etat. And it's a very fuzzy, messy set of facts. But the fact that this regional organization called it a coup had very serious and real consequences for the country. They couldn't trade with anybody, there couldn't appear at these regional delegations, and that forced the parties to kind of get together and negotiate a solution. So I think it really can make a difference, even if it's just regional. Someone's asking me a great question about U.S. state laws against the practice and advocacy of boycotting the occupation of Palestinians on the West Bank. These are what the so-called BDS, anti-BDS laws. And actually, we had a talk at the law school a couple of years ago, I guess, by the author of many of those laws. And I just disagree with him completely. I don't understand why that's an exception to our general principles of free speech or academic freedom, that one could, advocate for that particular position. I don't think it's the right position necessarily, but I don't see why it should be excluded by state law. And without having looked at it in detail, I would just assume that those state laws often violate the First Amendment. So that's my particular position, and be happy to talk with you more about that. From Hassan, we have the right to self-determination of peoples. Good. I mean, this is basically what I'm saying. Now, the self-determination of peoples is kind of an interesting principle. It seems to be very pro-democratic. And it certainly is in the broad sense of giving peoples the right to be free from colonial powers. And that was when the principle was developed. But it does not mean, surely, that every people gets to have their own country. That would be very destabilizing for the international system. And so I think there's come to be an agreement that whatever self-determination means, it doesn't mean the right to have your own country for everybody. It does mean that you do have certain cultural rights. And so, I think what's going on in Xinjiang or Inner Mongolia or Tibet, I think are violations of that general principle of self-determination. These are peoples, clearly, the minorities in China, that are unable, increasingly they're not allowed to be taught in their own languages and things like this. And that's a violation. So the self-determination principle also means, though, that if you decided, the people get to, the dominant government is the communist government, that's okay, right? You can have projects which are not necessarily democratic, as long as they reflect some sort of sense of, choice, and that body has some kind of control over the population. I think this will probably be the last question from Adiha on the demise of democracy. What about religion and culture and sort of the tension that exists between different groups? Well, that's a very interesting question about Christianity changing the Roman education system and affecting the way the Romans lived, playing a factor in the empire's collapse. That's a great question. I'm not sure I have a terrific immediate answer. I do think that our genius of our country has always been its lowering the stakes of government. That's a key thing if you think about democracy, right? And part of the problem that we're having right now is that, from my point of view, one party has just got it's ramped up so much with these, everything is existential. Every little fight is like the end of the world, and everyone's a Nazi and a socialist and a totalitarian. That's just not the case, That's not really a fact. But when people get that worried about things, then they are willing to tolerate moves that they would not tolerate in normal times. And that is a great threat to democracy. Democracy is about lowering the stakes of political conflict. And that's why, the genius of our founding fathers, not to allow the country to use your question's example, a Christian country, but to be epistemically open to whatever the people want to decide and want to become. It's the genius of the First Amendment, the anti-foundationalist genius of the First Amendment. And, it's sometimes uncomfortable. we have a lot of tension and fight over what we're going to become. But that is the American way, the American experiment, and I'm hoping that it will survive. I don't think the diversity of the country is any threat to it. I think it's actually our great strength. Oh, there's a question from Dean Miles. Excuse me. Maybe I'll just very quickly. I have 1 minute left, Dean Miles, so I'll just ask about and try to answer your question. Dean Miles asked me about whether or not COVID-19 has accelerated the erosion of democracy. And that's been very interesting. I wrote a paper on this. It's just come out on the, you always think like, oh, in an emergency, there's going to be an abuse of emergency powers and, someone's going to lock in their power. And we certainly have seen that in some countries where anti-disinformation laws about COVID were used to suppress the opposition. Cambodia is a good example. But we've also seen countries like I mentioned, Malawi, where the crisis actually meant that relatively weak wannabe dictators were not able to take over. So I think the general effect is mixed, quite mixed. And we don't, at the end of the day, probably has made democracies look a little better than the Chinese response, as effective as that was, because there's now widespread suspicion that the virus escaped accidentally from the Chinese lab, but we'll never know because of the repressive environment.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for a really fascinating discussion. Thank you for joining us today and sharing your scholarship and your great ideas with us. And to our alumni and friends, thank you for tuning in. Again, I wish we could convene in person, but I'm looking forward to the day in the hopefully not so distant future when we can do that. Also, for our alumni and friends, please look forward to additional programming coming your way. Watch for more information. And of course, watch for Professor Ginsburg and Professor Flores' new podcast entitled. So everyone stay safe, stay healthy. And again, I look forward to seeing you all, I hope in person very soon. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you for the great questions.